You've probably pictured medieval castles as drafty and cold, right? Think again. What if I told you that centuries ago, people developed heating systems so advanced, so brilliantly engineered, they'd make modern architects scratch their heads, even if they were outlawed? We're peeling back the layers on the surprising, often dangerous, physics that allowed medieval homes to achieve remarkable warmth, revealing the forbidden ingenuity that defied the era's limitations. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1. The winter that changed everything. Expanded. The winter of 1306 began unremarkably enough in London. September had been mild, October pleasant, and November showed the typical damp chill that Londoners had endured for generations. But when December arrived, it brought with it something that would fundamentally alter the relationship between medieval society and the very fire that kept them alive. The first snows fell on December 8th, according to monastic records kept at Westminster Abbey. Within a week, the accumulation had reached levels that the oldest residents couldn't recall seeing in their lifetimes. But snow was only the beginning. What followed was a cold so intense, so penetrating, that it seemed to reach through stone walls, through the thickest wool, through every defense that medieval technology could muster against the elements. The Thames, that great liquid highway that served as London's main artery of commerce, began to freeze, not just at the edges, where thin ice might form on a typical winter morning, but completely, solidly, across its entire breadth. By January, the river had become a solid road of ice, thick enough to support horses, carts, and even small market stalls. The Frost Fair of 1306, as it would later be called, was not the celebration that later Frost Fairs would become. It was born of desperation, of merchants needing to continue trade by any means necessary, of a city adapting to conditions that seemed biblically apocalyptic. Inside the timber-framed houses that crowded London's narrow streets, families huddled together in conditions that were barely survivable. The typical medieval house had minimal insulation walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven wooden strips covered with a combination of clay, dung, and straw. These walls might keep out wind and rain, but against the penetrating cold of 1306, they were nearly useless. Windows, where they existed, were covered with oiled parchment or thin sheets of horn, materials that allowed some light to pass through, but did almost nothing to prevent cold air from seeping into living spaces. The wealthy had glass windows, a luxury so expensive that many aristocrats would remove the glass panes when they traveled and take them along, reinstalling them at their next residence. But even glass, in the crude form available in medieval England, was full of imperfections, bubbles, and thin spots that conducted cold with ruthless efficiency. And because glass was so valuable, windows were small, limiting both light and the size of the opening that needed to be covered. In this frozen city, fire became more than a convenience or a cooking tool. It became the difference between life and death. Every household with the means to do so kept fires burning continuously, day and night, for months. The central hearth, typically located in the middle of the main room, with smoke venting through a hole in the roof, or in more advanced homes, through a chimney, became the focal point of existence. Families slept in concentric circles around it, with the most valued members elderly parents, young children closest to the warmth. But maintaining these fires required fuel, and fuel was becoming scarce at an alarming rate. London's population in 1306 stood at approximately 80,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. The surrounding forests, which had provided firewood for generations, had already been heavily depleted by centuries of harvesting. Wood had to be transported from increasingly distant locations, driving prices to levels that made it unaffordable for common laborers. This is where our story truly begins, because desperation breeds innovation, and innovation in the absence of scientific knowledge can be extraordinarily dangerous. For years, merchants had been bringing a black, sooty substance into London by boat. It was called sea coal, named not because it came from the sea, but because it arrived by sea. Found along the northeastern coast of England, particularly around Newcastle. This coal would wash up on beaches, exposed by erosion from coastal cliffs containing coal seams. Enterprising locals collected it and sold it to merchants, who recognized that it would burn. Initially, sea coal had been used primarily by lime burners, blacksmiths, and other tradespeople who needed intense, sustained heat for their work. Most households avoided it. It was dirty, it smelled terrible when burning, and it produced a thick, choking smoke unlike anything wood fires created. The black soot it generated coated everything: walls, furniture, clothes, and lungs. Most Londoners considered it inferior fuel, suitable only for those unfortunate enough to be unable to afford proper wood. But the winter of 1306 changed calculations. When wood prices tripled, then quadrupled, coal suddenly became economical. When wood became unavailable at any price, coal became necessary. Households began burning it out of sheer survival instinct, and they quickly discovered something remarkable. Coal burned much hotter than wood, and a small amount lasted far longer. The science behind this, unknown to medieval Londoners, is straightforward but fascinating. Wood is primarily composed of cellulose and lignin, complex organic molecules that release energy when oxidized, which is what combustion fundamentally is. A pound of dry hardwood contains approximately 7,000 to 8,000 British thermal units, BTUs of energy. Coal, by contrast, is almost pure carbon with various impurities. A pound of bituminous coal, the type commonly found along the Newcastle coast, contains between 10,000 and 14,000 BTUs. This means that pound for pound, coal delivered roughly 50% to 75% more heat than wood. For a family struggling to stay warm, this was transformative. A cart of coal could do the work of a cart and a half of wood. It burned longer, maintaining heat through the night with less frequent stoking. The intense heat it generated could warm a room more effectively than the traditional wood fire. But coal had a dark secret, one that would reveal itself gradually and terribly over that frozen winter. The problem lay in coal's impurities, particularly sulfur. Coal forms from ancient plant matter that has been compressed and heated over millions of years under geological pressure. During this process, various elements present in the original plant material or in the surrounding geological formations become incorporated into the coal's structure. Sulfur is one of the most common and most problematic of these impurities. When coal burns, the sulfur oxidizes, combining with oxygen in the air to form sulfur dioxide, a colorless gas with a sharp, acrid smell, like matches being struck. In small quantities and in well-ventilated spaces, sulfur dioxide is merely unpleasant. But in the enclosed spaces of medieval homes, during a winter, when every opening was sealed against the deadly cold, sulfur dioxide accumulated to dangerous levels. Medieval houses were not designed for the kind of combustion coal required. Wood fires could function adequately with the simple smoke holes and early chimneys that London homes possessed. Coal fires, burning hotter and producing different combustion products, needed better ventilation systems that simply didn't exist. As families burned coal through January and February of 1306, people began to sicken. The symptoms started subtly: persistent coughs, shortness of breath, burning sensations in the throat and chest. These might have been dismissed as ordinary winter ailments, the kind of respiratory infections that always circulated during cold months. But the severity was different. Children and elderly people, those with the most vulnerable respiratory systems, began dying at rates that alarmed even a society accustomed to high mortality. Physicians of the period, working with the medical knowledge inherited from classical sources and their own observations, noted the correlation between coal burning and respiratory distress. They didn't understand the chemistry. The concept of specific gases causing specific physiological effects wouldn't be understood for another 500 years, but they could see cause and effect. Households burning coal experienced more illness than those burning wood. The mechanism of sulfur dioxide toxicity is brutal. When this gas contacts the moist surfaces of the respiratory tract, the nose, throat, bronchial tubes, and lung tissues, it dissolves in the water present to form sulfurous acid. This is the same chemical reaction that creates acid rain in our modern industrial age. Inside the delicate tissues of the lungs, sulfurous acid causes immediate chemical burns, triggering inflammation, excessive mucus production, and bronchial constriction. The body's natural response to protect itself: coughing. Increased mucus actually makes breathing more difficult. For someone with healthy lungs, exposure to moderate levels of sulfur dioxide causes temporary discomfort and coughing. For children, whose respiratory systems are still developing, or for the elderly, whose lung capacity and resilience have diminished, the effects could be fatal. Chronic exposure, day after day, as families kept their coal fires burning continuously, caused progressive damage that even healthy adults couldn't overcome indefinitely. But sulfur dioxide wasn't the only hazard. Coal combustion produces carbon monoxide, especially when the fire doesn't receive adequate oxygen, a common situation in enclosed medieval homes. Carbon monoxide is an insidious killer, odorless and colorless, giving no warning of its presence. It works by binding to hemoglobin in the blood, the molecule responsible for transporting oxygen from the lungs to every cell in the body. The chemistry here is elegantly vicious. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin with an affinity roughly 200 times greater than oxygen. Once bound, it doesn't readily release, effectively blocking that hemoglobin molecule from carrying oxygen. As carbon monoxide accumulates in an enclosed space, people breathing it gradually replace the oxygen-carrying capacity of their blood with a useless, oxygen-blocking substitute. The result is cellular suffocation. The lungs may be working perfectly, breathing in and out, but the blood cannot deliver oxygen to the brain, heart, and other vital organs. The symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning would have been confusing to medieval observers. Unlike sulfur dioxide, which causes immediate, obvious respiratory distress, carbon monoxide creates headaches, dizziness, confusion, and weakness, symptoms that could be attributed to dozens of other causes. People might simply feel tired, lie down near the warm fire for a nap, and never wake up. Entire families could be affected simultaneously, with no one well enough to recognize what was happening and open windows or doors to ventilate the space. By February 1306, the death toll in London had become impossible to ignore. Parish records show spikes in burials that exceeded even the typical high winter mortality. The correlation with coal burning was becoming clear to city authorities and to King Edward I himself, who maintained a residence in London and took an active interest in the governance of his capital city. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his unusual height and the Hammer of the Scots for his military campaigns, was not a man inclined toward half measures. When he identified a problem, he attacked it with the same fierce determination he brought to warfare. The coal crisis presented a clear threat to public health, to the economic vitality of his capital, and potentially to public order if people began to riot over the mounting deaths. The solution he implemented was radical: a royal proclamation banning the burning of sea coal within the City of London. The proclamation was comprehensive and severe. It didn't merely discourage coal use or tax, it outlawed it entirely. Anyone found burning coal would face immediate punishment. Their furnaces would be demolished, their coal stocks confiscated. Repeat offenders faced imprisonment. The enforcement was real. Edward appointed commissioners specifically tasked with investigating reports of coal burning. They had the authority to enter homes, examine hearths, and order immediate demolition of any furnace found to be burning coal. This was an extraordinary invasion of private property rights, justified by what we would now recognize as public health emergency powers. The ban created immediate hardship. Coal had become essential for survival during that brutal winter, and would remain scarce and expensive. But Edward offered an alternative. He opened royal forests to limited wood harvesting and organized shipments of wood from more distant regions, using royal resources to subsidize the cost. It was an early example of government intervention in a market failure. The private market couldn't provide adequate heating fuel at affordable prices, so the Crown stepped in. The scientific principle Edward was unknowingly applying was the precautionary principle. When an activity poses threats of serious harm, protective measures should be taken even if scientific certainty about cause and effect is incomplete. Medieval authorities could analyze air samples for sulfur dioxide concentrations or measure carbon monoxide levels in parts per million, but they could observe that coal burning correlated with death and illness. That was sufficient evidence for action. The winter of 1306 eventually ended, as all winters do. Spring came late that year, with freezing conditions persisting into April, but eventually the Thames thawed, temperatures rose, and the desperate need for constant heating diminished. The immediate crisis passed, but it left a permanent mark on London's history and on the evolution of public health policy. Edward's coal ban would be periodically reimposed and relaxed over the following centuries. Coal was too useful, too economical, and too abundant for the ban to hold permanently. But the principle had been established. Certain heating methods, however effective, were too dangerous to permit in densely populated areas. The government had a responsibility to protect public health, even at economic cost. This represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. Prior to events like the coal crisis of 1306, people generally assumed they could burn whatever they wished in their own homes. The king's authority extended to taxation, justice, and warfare, but not to the intimate details of domestic life. The coal ban broke that assumption. It established that public health emergencies could justify government intervention into the most private spaces of people's lives. Modern air quality science vindicates Edwards' decision completely. Studies of indoor air pollution show that burning coal in enclosed spaces without adequate ventilation creates sulfur dioxide concentrations that would be illegal under modern air quality standards within minutes. The particulate matter, tiny soot particles that penetrate deep into lung tissue, reaches levels associated with serious long-term health consequences. The carbon monoxide levels can spike into the lethal range in a matter of hours. We now know that the health effects observed in 1306 London were just the acute, immediate impacts. Chronic exposure to coal smoke, even at levels that don't cause immediate death, has devastating long-term consequences. It causes cancer, heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and a host of other conditions. Children exposed to coal smoke show impaired lung development and cognitive delays. Pregnant women exposed to high levels of particulate matter have higher rates of premature birth and low birth weight babies. The winter of 1306 was a turning point, a moment when humanity confronted the unintended consequences of a technological innovation using coal for heating, and made a collective decision to restrict that technology despite its benefits. It wouldn't be the last time. Over the centuries that followed, authorities would ban, regulate, or restrict numerous heating methods, fuels, and technologies as their dangers became apparent. But in that frozen February of 1306, as commissioners went house to house demolishing coal furnaces and families shivered through the lingering cold, the lesson was just beginning to be learned. Warmth at any cost might cost more than we can afford to pay. Segment 2. The Coal Revolution nobody wanted expanded. The story of coal in medieval England is the story of humanity's first major encounter with fossil fuels. And like many first encounters with powerful technologies, it was characterized by naive enthusiasm, followed by horrified realization of consequences nobody had anticipated. Coal would eventually power the Industrial Revolution, transform the global economy, and fundamentally alter Earth's climate. But in medieval England, it was simply a black rock that burned, and understanding why it burned the way it did would require scientific advances that would uncome for centuries. Coal's presence in England had been known since Roman times. The Romans, with their characteristic engineering sophistication, had used coal in Britain for heating their villas and bathhouses, particularly in regions where it was easily accessible at the surface. Archaeological excavations of Roman sites in Britain have uncovered coal residues and specially designed furnaces that suggest a sophisticated understanding of how to use this fuel effectively. But when the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, much of their technological knowledge departed with them. For the early medieval period, coal remained a curiosity, occasionally used but never extensively exploited. England's vast forests provided abundant wood, and the cultural knowledge of coal utilization had largely been lost. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, circumstances were changing in ways that would make coal increasingly attractive. England's population was growing rapidly. From perhaps 1.5 million people at the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the population expanded to over 4 million by 1300. These people needed to be fed, housed, and kept warm. The agricultural expansion necessary to feed this population required clearing forests for farmland. Simultaneously, the growing population needed more wood for construction and fuel. The deforestation was dramatic and widespread. Regions that had been heavily forested in 1000 AD were largely cleared by 1300 AD. The Forest of Dean, the New Forest, Sherwood Forest, the great woodland areas that figure so prominently in medieval English literature were already diminished shadows of their former extent by the High Middle Ages, and as forests receded, the cost of transporting wood from increasingly distant sources made fuel progressively more expensive. This is where coal entered the picture in a serious way. Along the northeastern coast of England, particularly around what would become Newcastle upon Tyne. Coal seams were exposed in coastal cliffs. Wave action and erosion would dislodge chunks of coal, which would wash up on beaches where they could be easily collected. Locals called it sea coal because it came from the sea, and they sold it to merchants who recognized its value. The coal trade began modestly in the 12th century, but by the 13th century it had become a major industry. Ships would sail to Newcastle, load up with coal, and transport it down the coast to London and other cities. For blacksmiths, metalworkers, and lime burners, coal was revolutionary. These trades required sustained high temperatures that consumed enormous quantities of wood, charcoal. Coal could provide those temperatures more economically and more reliably. A blacksmith could maintain his forge at working temperature all day with less fuel, less effort, and less expense. The productivity gains were substantial. The science behind coal's superior performance as an industrial fuel lies in its chemical composition and energy density. To understand this, we need to understand what coal actually is. Coal forms from plant material ancient forests, swamps, and peat bogs that has been buried under layers of sediment and subjected to heat and pressure over millions of years. The process is called coalification, and it progressively transforms plant matter into increasingly carbon-rich forms. The lowest rank of coal is lignite, sometimes called brown coal, which is only partially liquefied. It still contains substantial moisture and has relatively low energy content. Moving up the coal rank, we encounter subbituminous coal, then bituminous coal, the type most commonly found around Newcastle, and finally anthracite, the highest rank, which is almost pure carbon. The coal being mined and collected in medieval England was primarily bituminous coal. Under a microscope, bituminous coal shows complex structures, remnants of the original plant materials, compressed and transformed but still visible. Chemically, it's composed of approximately 75 to 85% carbon, with the remainder being hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and various mineral impurities. When coal burns, the carbon atoms combine with oxygen from the air in an exothermic reaction, a reaction that releases energy in the form of heat. The chemical equation is elegantly simple. C plus O gives CO plus energy. Each carbon atom combines with one oxygen molecule to produce carbon dioxide and release energy. Because coal is so carbon dense, much more so than wood, it releases more energy per unit of weight. But that simple equation only tells part of the story. Real-world coal combustion is far messier than a clean chemical equation suggests. When coal burns, it doesn't just produce carbon dioxide. The hydrogen in the coal combines with oxygen to form water vapor. The sulfur, and this is crucial to our story, combines with oxygen to form sulfur dioxide. So if the combustion is hot enough, sulfur trioxide, medieval coal users understood none of this chemistry. The concept of chemical elements wouldn't be formulated until the 17th century. But medieval users could observe the effects. Coal burned hotter, lasted longer, and produced terrible smoke. The smoke from coal fires is qualitatively different from wood smoke. Wood smoke, while certainly not healthy, consists primarily of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and various organic compounds that give it its characteristic smell. It's light and grey, rising quickly and dispersing relatively easily. Coal smoke is thick, black, and heavy. It contains large quantities of particulate matter, tiny, solid particles of soot and ash that can remain suspended in air for extended periods. The particulate matter in coal smoke is particularly dangerous because of its size. These particles cannot be effectively cleared by the lung's normal defense mechanisms, and they accumulate in lung tissue over time, causing inflammation, scarring, and eventually serious disease. But the most immediate danger from coal smoke was the sulfur dioxide. The coal found around Newcastle, like most coal deposits, contained significant sulfur, typically 1 to 2% by weight, though some seams were much higher. This doesn't sound like much, But when you're burning hundreds of pounds of coal over a winter, you're releasing substantial quantities of sulfur compounds into the air. When sulfur dioxide enters the respiratory system, it dissolves in the moisture on the mucous membranes to form sulfurous acid HSOs. This is a classic acid-base reaction, so plus HO gives HSO. Exposure to concentrations above 5 parts per million ppm causes throat irritation in most people. Above 20 ppm, it causes significant respiratory distress. Above 100 ppm, exposure can be life-threatening, especially for those with pre-existing respiratory conditions. In the enclosed spaces of medieval homes, burning coal without adequate ventilation, concentrations could easily reach and exceed these dangerous levels. Children were particularly susceptible, as their respiratory systems are still developing and their breathing rates are higher relative to body size, meaning they inhale more air and, thus, more pollutants per pound of body weight. The elderly suffered disproportionately as well, as lung capacity and resilience decline with age. Medieval medical texts describe patients who could breathe reasonably well under normal circumstances, but would experience severe breathing difficulties when exposed to coal smoke, sometimes fatally. We now understand this as the triggering of bronchospasm and acute inflammation in already compromised airways. Beyond sulfur dioxide, coal combustion produces carbon monoxide, especially when the fire doesn't receive adequate oxygen. This happens when too much coal is loaded onto the fire, when air supply is restricted, or when volatile compounds being released from the coal consume available oxygen faster than it can be replenished. In a medieval home with limited ventilation and during a severe winter, every opening would be sealed against the cold. Carbon monoxide could accumulate to deadly levels. Carbon monoxide poisoning is particularly insidious because it gives no warning. The first symptoms: headache, dizziness, nausea, vague and easily attributed to other causes. By the time symptoms become severe, the victim may be too confused or weakened to take corrective action. The mechanism of carbon monoxide toxicity is molecular hijacking. Hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that transports oxygen, consists of 4 subunits, each containing an iron atom that can bind one oxygen molecule. When you breathe in oxygen, it diffuses across the lung membranes into the bloodstream, where it binds to these iron atoms. The hemoglobin then carries the oxygen to tissues throughout the body, where it releases the oxygen for cellular use. Carbon monoxide binds to these same iron atoms in hemoglobin, but it binds much more tightly than oxygen, about 200 to 250 times more tightly, depending on conditions. Once carbon monoxide occupies a binding site, it doesn't readily release. The hemoglobin molecule is effectively disabled, unable to carry oxygen. As carbon monoxide accumulates in the bloodstream, an increasing percentage of hemoglobin molecules become useless for oxygen transport. When approximately 40 to 50% of hemoglobin is bound to carbon monoxide instead of oxygen, most people lose consciousness. Above 60 to 70%, death becomes likely. And because carbon monoxide binds so tightly, recovery is slow. Even after exposure ends, it takes hours for carbon monoxide to gradually release from hemoglobin and be exhaled. Medieval Londoners would have experienced all of these effects without understanding their cause. A family burning coal through a cold night might wake up with headaches and nausea if they woke up at all. Some wouldn't wake up, having slipped from sleep into unconsciousness into death without ever knowing what was happening. Survivors might attribute their symptoms to bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment. but they couldn't identify the odorless, invisible carbon monoxide as the actual cause. The authorities' response to coal's dangers developed gradually. Initially, coal burning was merely discouraged. Physicians warned against it, and some landlords prohibited it in their properties. But as coal use spread, driven by economic necessity, regulations became more stringent. Various London councils passed ordinances limiting coal use, though these were irregularly enforced. King Edward I's proclamation in 1306, triggered by that terrible winter, represented the most comprehensive and strictly enforced ban yet attempted. But even Edward's ban couldn't last indefinitely. Coal was simply too useful and too economical. As soon as the immediate crisis passed, coal burning resumed, though with somewhat better ventilation in many cases. The long-term solution, which wouldn't fully develop for another 3 centuries, was better chimney design. Medieval chimneys, when they existed at all, were simple affairs, essentially a vertical channel to let smoke exit the building. They often drew poorly, especially in certain wind conditions, and they weren't designed for the different combustion characteristics of coal versus wood. Coal fires require more airflow than wood fires because coal burns at higher temperatures and consumes oxygen more rapidly. They also produce more combustion products that need to be vented. But in medieval London, this knowledge was still being learned, often at a terrible cost. The pattern repeated itself across England and eventually across Europe as coal use spread. Initial enthusiasm for this powerful new fuel, followed by illness and death, followed by bans or restrictions, followed by gradual development of safer usage methods, followed by resumed use. It was a dangerous learning curve, and many died while society climbed it. The coal trade, despite periodic restrictions, continued to grow. By the late medieval period, thousands of tons of coal were being shipped from Newcastle to London annually. The economic incentives were simply too powerful to resist. Coal enabled industries that wood couldn't support at scale. The lime burning necessary for construction, the metal working essential for tools and weapons, the glass making, pottery firing, and numerous other crafts all became more productive and economical with coal. Aristocrats and prosperous merchants could afford wood and preferred it. Burning wood was a status symbol, a sign that you didn't need to resort to dirty, smelly coal. The poor had no such luxury. They burned coal because it was what they could afford, and they suffered the health consequences disproportionately. This created an early example of environmental injustice, a situation where the negative consequences of a technology or practice fall disproportionately on the poor and vulnerable. The wealthy could avoid coal smoke by living in well-ventilated manor houses, burning clean wood. The poor lived in cramped, poorly ventilated houses in the most polluted parts of the city, burned coal because nothing else was affordable, and died young of respiratory diseases. Medieval physicians noted these patterns. Medical texts from the 14th and 15th centuries describe what they called the coal cough, a chronic, productive cough associated with coal smoke exposure. They recommended that patients avoid coal smoke if possible, but this advice was useless to those who had no alternative fuel source. Some physicians even tried to calculate the years of life lost to coal smoke, though without modern epidemiological tools, their estimates were necessarily imprecise. Modern analysis of medieval skeletal remains provides stark evidence of coal smoke's health impacts. Bones from individuals buried in collusing areas show characteristics associated with chronic respiratory disease, changes in the ribs consistent with chronic hyperinflation of the lungs, and in some cases, evidence of core pulmonale heart failure secondary to lung disease. Examination of preserved tissue samples, in the rare cases where such material has survived, shows carbon deposits deep in lung tissue, evidence of the coal smoke these individuals breathed day after day. The coal revolution of medieval England was thus a revolution nobody wanted but everyone felt compelled to accept. It offered undeniable benefits: more heat per pound of fuel, lower costs, and the ability to support industries that wood couldn't sustain. But it came with terrible costs: polluted air, chronic disease, and thousands of preventable deaths. Medieval society struggled to find a balance, imposing periodic restrictions but never fully abandoning coal despite knowing its dangers. This struggle continues today on a global scale. Coal still provides approximately 35% of the world's electricity and produces similar pollutants sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and now recognized as well, carbon dioxide contributing to climate change. The medieval coal revolution was humanity's first large-scale experiment with fossil fuels, and the lessons learned that economic benefits can't justify unlimited health and environmental costs, that regulation is necessary to protect public welfare, that technological improvements can mitigate but not eliminate dangers, remain relevant 7 centuries later. Segment 3. The blacksmith's secret weapon expanded. In the shadowy workshops of medieval England, where iron glowed orange and hammers rang against anvils in hypnotic rhythm, blacksmiths possessed knowledge that elevated them above common craftsmen into something approaching alchemists. They could transform raw ore into tools, weapons, and hardware essential to medieval life. They could make metal flow like water, fuse separate pieces into unified wholes, and impart properties of hardness or flexibility as needed. And at the heart of their art lay a secret weapon, high-quality charcoal that could generate temperatures hot enough to fundamentally transform the nature of iron itself. The story of charcoal in medieval metallurgy is a story of pushing natural materials to their physical limits and discovering, often tragically, where those limits lay. To understand why charcoal was so crucial to blacksmiths, we need to understand the challenge they faced. Iron, as it comes from the ore, is relatively soft and brittle. It can be worked, but it doesn't hold a sharp edge well, and it breaks under stress. What blacksmiths needed to create was steel iron infused with a small percentage of carbon, typically 0.3% to 1.5% by weight. This tiny amount of carbon, arranged in the crystalline structure of iron, dramatically changes its properties, making it harder, stronger, and capable of holding an edge sharp enough to shave with. Creating steel required heating iron to temperatures where carbon could diffuse into its crystalline structure. Charcoal is not simply burned wood. It's wood that has been heated in the absence of oxygen, a process called pyrolysis. When wood burns normally, it combines with oxygen in a combustion reaction that produces carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. But when wood is heated without sufficient oxygen to support combustion, it undergoes chemical decomposition instead. The complex organic molecules that make up wood, primarily cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, break down into simpler compounds. The volatile compounds, the gases and liquids, are driven off, leaving behind almost pure carbon in a solid form. This is charcoal. Because it's nearly pure carbon, with most of the hydrogen, oxygen, and other elements removed, charcoal can burn at much higher temperatures than wood. Cover them with turf or dirt to exclude oxygen, and then ignite them through carefully placed vents. The art was in controlling the burn, allowing enough air in to sustain the pyrolysis, but not so much that the wood simply combusted to ash. A typical charcoal mound might contain several cords of wood and burn for days or even weeks, requiring constant attention. Feeling the heat radiating from different parts of the mound, and adjusting ventilation through a complex system of holes that could be opened or closed. Carbon monoxide is a byproduct of the incomplete combustion and pyrolysis occurring inside the charcoal mound. Unlike the carbon dioxide produced by clean combustion, Carbon monoxide results when carbon is oxidized with insufficient oxygen to complete the reaction to CO. The chemical process is straightforward. C plus 1/2 O gives CO. In the oxygen-starved interior of a charcoal mound, this reaction occurs extensively. The carbon monoxide produced during charcoaling is released in the smoke over days or weeks of burning. But when charcoal production moved closer to populated areas, driven by the same deforestation pressures that made coal attractive, the dangers multiplied. Carbon monoxide is denser than air. Has a molecular weight of 28 compared to air's average of about 29, which means it doesn't rise and disperse as readily as some other gases. On calm days or in valleys, it can accumulate in deadly concentrations, and because it's odorless and colorless, it gives no warning of its presence. The incident in York in 1334 that contributed to the banning of urban charcoaling was documented in the city's records. A collier had constructed a charcoal mound on the edge of the city, probably to save on transportation costs of bringing charcoal from distant forests. The mound was built on low ground, and the weather was unusually calm. Over the course of several days, carbon monoxide accumulated in the hollow where the mound was burning. By morning, all 5 were dead, with no signs of violence or obvious illness. The investigation that followed, conducted by the coroner and city officials, traced the deaths to the charcoal mound. Other families in the area reported symptoms we now recognize as carbon monoxide poisoning: headaches, dizziness, nausea. The collier himself was found in a confused state, having been chronically exposed to lower levels of the gas. The mound was immediately broken apart and extinguished, and the city council moved swiftly to ban charcoal production within city limits. But the danger wasn't only from the production of charcoal. The use of charcoal in smithies and other workshops also posed risks, particularly when these establishments were located in densely built urban areas with poor ventilation. A blacksmith's forge operating at full intensity could consume enormous quantities of charcoal and produce corresponding amounts of combustion products. The typical blacksmith's forge consisted of a hatha, shallow depression where charcoal was mounted with a twaya, a pipe through which air from bellows was forced into the base of the fire. At temperatures above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with abundant carbon from the charcoal in intimate contact with iron, carbon atoms migrate into the iron's crystalline structure. Iron at room temperature has a body-centered cubic crystal structure. At forging temperatures, it transforms to a face-centered cubic structure that can accommodate carbon atoms in the spaces between iron atoms. By carefully controlling the heating and cooling process, the exact temperature, the time at temperature, and the cooling rate, a skilled blacksmith could create steel with precisely the properties needed for a particular application. But many medieval smithies were in cramped urban locations with inadequate ventilation, especially in winter when every opening would be closed against the cold. While the heavy physical labor certainly contributed, chronic exposure to forge gases was likely a major factor. It damages the heart, muscle, and blood vessels, contributing to heart disease and early death. The production of the highest quality charcoal required selecting specific types of wood. Blacksmiths prized charcoal made from hardwoods, oak, ash, beech because these woods are dense and produce charcoal with better burning characteristics than softer woods like pine or willow. The denser the wood, the denser the resulting charcoal, and the longer it will burn at high temperature. But not all hardwood charcoal was equal. The finest steel required the finest charcoal, made from carefully selected straight-grained oak or ash, carefully collied to ensure complete pyrolysis without overburning. Blacksmiths working on high-value items, swords, armor, fine tools would pay these premium prices gladly, knowing that the quality of their final product depended on the quality of their fuel. This economic reality created strong incentives for charcoaling to continue despite the dangers and regulations. The most sophisticated workshops used water-powered bellows and carefully designed airflow systems that both supplied oxygen to the forge and carried away combustion products. The danger of charcoal mound collapse, mentioned in the segment, was real and terrifying. A charcoal mound under construction might be 10 or 15 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter, containing several tons of wood. And the entire structure might collapse explosively, scattering burning wood and hot charcoal across a wide area. Even if the physical collapse didn't directly harm anyone, the sudden massive release of carbon monoxide could create lethal air quality in nearby buildings. Complete bans on charcoaling near populated areas, like the one enacted in York, became common in major cities by the 14th century. Mounds might be required to be certain distances from dwellings, to be constructed only during certain seasons when wind patterns favored safe dispersion of smoke, or to be monitored by appointed officials who could ensure proper construction and operation. For blacksmiths, the regulations focused more on ventilation and waste disposal than on banning the craft entirely. Cities needed smiths too much to drive them out completely. Building codes began to include requirements for smithies, specifying minimum chimney heights, hearth designs, and distances from neighboring buildings. Smiths operating without proper ventilation could be fined or even forced to close their shops. The sophistication of these regulations is remarkable when you consider that the people writing them had no understanding of gases, molecular structure, or the chemistry of combustion. The regulations they developed, through trial and error, often align surprisingly well with modern safety principles. Modern charcoal production, in regions where it still occurs using traditional methods, faces similar challenges. The blacksmith's secret weapon, high-quality charcoal, capable of generating temperatures needed for fine steelwork, was powerful, precisely because it was dangerous. Medieval blacksmiths accepted these risks as part of their trade, but medieval society increasingly refused to allow those risks to be imposed on bystanders and neighbors. Modern steel production has moved from charcoal to coke, a coal derivative, to, increasingly, electric arc furnaces. Each transition has brought new capabilities and new hazards. The medieval blacksmith, carefully managing his charcoal fire to achieve the perfect temperature for hardening a sword blade, would recognize the fundamental challenge. Creating something valuable requires energy, and concentrated energy is inherently dangerous. Managing that danger, protecting workers and communities while still reaping the benefits of industrial craft, remains one of society's ongoing challenges. Segment 4. The dung burners of Dublin expanded the practice of burning dried animal dung for fuel is ancient, predating recorded history. Archaeological evidence shows that prehistoric peoples burned dung when wood was scarce. In Ireland, where our focus lies, and in parts of Western Britain, dung burning became not merely a desperate expedient. Dried cow dung is, from a chemical and thermodynamic perspective, a perfectly reasonable fuel. Understanding why requires looking at what dung actually is and how combustion works. Cattle are ruminants. They have a complex four-chambered stomach that allows them to digest cellulose, the structural material that makes up plant cell walls. Humans cannot digest cellulose. It passes through our digestive system unchanged, which is why we call it dietary fiber. And lignin, the same organic compounds that make wood a good fuel. Cow dung also contains undigested plant matter, bacteria dead and alive, and various mineral compounds. When dried, this material becomes combustible. The drying process is crucial. Fresh manure is approximately 75 to 80% water. In this wet state, it woe on to burn UD, expend more energy evaporating the water than UD get back from combusting the organic material. But when dried in the sun and wind, manure loses most of its moisture content, leaving a material that's perhaps 10 to 15% water and 85 to 90% dry matter. This dry matter includes undigested cellulose and lignin, 40 to 50% proteins and amino acids, 10 to 15% fats and waxes, 2 to 5% minerals and ash, 15 to 25% bacterial remains and other organic matter. Remainder, the cellulose and lignin, being structurally similar to wood, burn well. The proteins and fats actually contain more energy per gram than cellulose. In Ireland and Western Britain, the practice of dung burning developed into an efficient system. Cattle manure would be collected and formed into cakes or bricks, often mixed with straw or hay for structural integrity. These would be stacked in the sun to dry, sometimes for weeks or months. Properly dried dung bricks were hard, lightweight, and stored well, remaining combustible for years if kept dry. The burning characteristics of dung were actually quite good for cooking and heating. Unlike wood, which burns quickly with a hot flame, dried dung burns slowly and steadily with a moderate heat. A properly made dung fire could be maintained for hours with minimal attention, making it ideal for slow cooking or for maintaining background warmth in a cottage. The slow burn also meant that a modest supply of dung cakes could last a family through the winter. Irish peasants developed sophisticated knowledge about dung fuel. They knew that dung from cattle eating hay produced better fuel than dung from cattle on fresh pasture. They knew that mixing in different proportions of straw changed the burning rate. They could judge the moisture content by weight and flexibility, ensuring that their fuel was properly dried before storage. But as dung burning became more common in urban areas during the 13th and 14th centuries, driven by the same wood scarcity that made coal attractive in England, problems emerged. The issues weren't immediately obvious. Dung fires didn't produce the acrid sulfur smoke that coal fires did, and they didn't pose the explosive hazards of charcoal mounds. The dangers were more subtle, but ultimately just as deadly. The problem lay in the incomplete combustion that dung fires produced. When wood burns with adequate oxygen supply, the cellulose and lignin are oxidized completely to carbon dioxide and water vapor. But dung, with its complex mixture of compounds and relatively high ash content, doesn't burn as completely. The combustion produces substantial quantities of partially oxidized compounds, carbon monoxide, of course, but also a complex array of organic molecules. Among the most dangerous of these are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or Peat. These are molecules composed of multiple benzene rings fused together, created when organic material combusts incompletely at moderate temperatures. Some common pots include naphthalene 2-benzene rings, anthracene 3 rings, and benzoapyrene 5 rings. These compounds are formed in the oxygen-poor, moderate temperature conditions that prevail in a typical dung fire. PAHs are concerning because many of them are carcinogenic. When inhaled, they can damage DNA in lung cells, potentially leading to cancer. When they condense on food being cooked over the fire, they can be ingested, causing similar damage to digestive tract cells. The carcinogenic mechanism is complex. The PAHs themselves aren't highly reactive, but when metabolized by enzymes in the body, they're converted into reactive intermediates that bind to DNA and cause mutations. Medieval physicians and authorities didn't know about PAs or understand cancer at a molecular level. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be developed for another 5 centuries, and the concept of carcinogens was even further in the future. But they could observe patterns. Communities that burned dung extensively showed higher rates of certain diseases, chronic coughs, wasting illnesses, growths in the lungs and throat. The connection between dung burning and respiratory disease was noted in Irish medical texts from the medieval period. These texts, written in Gaelic and influenced by both classical medicine and local empirical observation, described what they called the dung cough, a chronic, progressive respiratory ailment affecting those who spent years breathing smoke from dung fires. The recommended treatment was to stop burning dung and move to areas with cleaner air. Advice that was practical for the wealthy but impossible for the poor. Modern epidemiological studies of communities that still use dung fuel provide hard numbers on the health impacts. A study in India found that women who cooked with dung fuel had significantly higher rates of chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and lung cancer compared to women using cleaner fuels. The level of particulate matter in homes heated with dung can exceed 2,000 micrograms per cubic meter during cooking times, more than 80 times the WHO guideline for air quality. The particulate matter from dung combustion is particularly problematic because of its size distribution and chemical composition. Children exposed to dung smoke show impaired lung development, with reduced lung capacity that persists into adulthood. Pregnant women exposed to high levels of biomass smoke, including dung smoke, have higher rates of low birth weight babies and premature births. The mechanisms are multiple: reduced oxygen availability due to carbon monoxide exposure, inflammatory responses to particulate matter, and direct toxic effects of compounds like Peat. In medieval Dublin, as dung burning became more common in the densely packed tenements of the city, these health effects became impossible to ignore. Parish death records from the 14th century show elevated mortality rates in areas where dung burning was most prevalent, particularly among children and the elderly. The connection was clear enough that city authorities moved to restrict the practice, though enforcement was difficult and sporadic. The ban on urban dung burning, implemented in Dublin and several other Irish cities during the 1400s, was never absolute. The economic reality was that many people simply had no other fuel option. Wood was expensive and scarce, coal wasn't yet being widely imported to Ireland, and peat, which we'll discuss shortly, required effort to harvest and transport that not everyone could manage. Dung was free, abundant, and readily available to anyone who kept cattle or who lived near someone who did. The authorities' approach became one of harm reduction rather than elimination. Dung burning was prohibited in the most densely populated areas where smoke accumulation posed the greatest danger. It was discouraged in enclosed spaces, with recommendations to burn dung only in outdoor fires or in well-ventilated hearths. Those who violated these regulations might face fines, though enforcement was inconsistent and often ignored for the poorest households who had no alternatives. The science behind the ban was sound, even if medieval authorities couldn't articulate it in modern terms. Indoor air pollution from biomass combustion, including dung, is now recognized as one of the world's leading environmental health risks. The WHO estimates that exposure to smoke from solid fuel combustion causes approximately 3.8 million premature deaths per year globally, primarily in developing countries where such fuels remain common. The combustion chemistry of dung is actually quite complex, varying with the source animal's diet, the moisture content, the combustion temperature, and the oxygen availability. A dung fire burning in an open outdoor hearth with good airflow produces very different emissions than the same dung burning in an enclosed space with restricted ventilation. The latter conditions, unfortunately the norm in medieval cottages during cold weather, produce the highest levels of dangerous compounds. One particularly nasty compound produced by dung combustion is acrolein, a simple aldehyde chemical formula, CH-CO, that's created when fats and proteins decompose at moderate temperatures with inadequate oxygen. Acrolein is intensely irritating to mucous membranes, causing immediate burning sensations in the eyes, nose, and throat. It's also toxic to cells, causing damage to the respiratory tract lining. Medieval texts describe the immediate effects of dung smoke in terms that clearly indicate acrolein exposure: burning eyes, throat irritation, coughing fits. These acute symptoms were uncomfortable but not usually dangerous. The long-term effects of chronic acrolein exposure: scarring of lung tissue, increased susceptibility to infections, accelerated aging of the respiratory system would have been less obvious but more serious. The social dynamics of dung burning reveal interesting aspects of medieval society. The rural poor burned dung without shamit was simply what one did with a material that was otherwise useless. But in cities, dung burning acquired a social stigma. It became associated with poverty and desperation, a sign that a household couldn't afford proper fuel. Some enterprising individuals attempted to improve dung fuel to make it cleaner burning and more socially acceptable. Recipes survive for processed dung cakes that included additives meant to improve combustion. These additives sometimes made things worse. Lime, when heated, doesn't actually improve combustion, but it can react with moisture to produce caustic calcium hydroxide, adding another irritant to the smoke. Salt, when heated to combustion temperatures, can produce small amounts of chlorine gas, definitely not an improvement. Irish cottages developed distinctive cooking arrangements, with the hearth often positioned near the door rather than centrally. Some cottages developed what we might call passive ventilation systems, with carefully designed openings that created airflow from the door, past the hearth, and out through roof vents or windows. These designs weren't based on understanding of fluid dynamics or combustion chemistry, but on empirical observation. These configurations reduced smoke accumulation and the associated respiratory symptoms. Elderly residents interviewed in the early 20th century recalled childhoods where dung cakes were still used to supplement peat or wood, especially during harsh winters when other fuels ran short. The hot air then flowed into a space beneath the raised floor, the hypercost chamber, which was created by supporting the floor on pillars of brick or stone, typically 18 to 24 inches high. The hot air would circulate through this underfloor space, warming the floor tiles above. The thermodynamic principles at work are elegant. Hot air from the furnace is less dense than cool air, creating buoyancy that drives circulation through the system, a natural convection current. Monasteries in Britain and on the continent occasionally maintained or even built new hypocaust systems during the medieval period, drawing on preserved Roman knowledge and adding their own innovations. Their monasteries, often located in remote areas with harsh climates, needed effective heating for the health and productivity of the monks. The medieval hypocaust differed in some details from Roman versions. Medieval builders often used different materials, adapted the design for available fuels wood rather than charcoal, and sometimes incorporated improvements like better insulation or more efficient furnace designs. But the basic principle remained: circulate hot air beneath a raised floor to create even comfortable heat. The advantages were real and substantial. A well-designed hypocaust could maintain a room at comfortable temperature with less fuel than a fireplace, because the heat was distributed efficiently rather than largely escaping up a chimney. The lack of open flames in the heated room reduced fire risk and eliminated smoke in the living space. The even temperature distribution was healthier and more comfortable than the extreme gradients produced by fireplaces. But the hypocaust had a fatal flaw, one that wouldn't become fully apparent until these systems were used in occupied buildings rather than bathhouses where people came and went. The flaw lay in the underground chambers, where hot air circulated chambers that also accumulated deadly gases. The furnace burning wood or charcoal to heat the hypocaust produced all the normal combustion products: carbon dioxide, water vapor, heat, and inevitably, some carbon monoxide. In an outdoor furnace with good airflow, the carbon monoxide would disperse harmlessly. But in a hypocaust system, the hot gases were channeled into the confined space beneath the floor. The wall flues were supposed to vent these gases safely outside, but the system didn't always work perfectly. Problems arose from several sources. The flues could become partially blocked by soot accumulation or debris. The natural draft that was supposed to pull gases through the system could be disrupted by wind conditions, particularly downdrafts on stormy days. The furnace could be fed too much fuel, producing more combustion gases than the flues could efficiently vent, or the system could simply be poorly designed, with inadequate venting capacity for the volume of gases being produced. When venting was inadequate, carbon monoxide accumulated in the hypocaust chamber. At first, this wasn't necessarily dangerous to occupants. Above the floor provided a barrier, and carbon monoxide remaining in the underground space wouldn't directly enter the rooms. But floors are never perfectly sealed. Cracks, gaps around pillars, or deliberate openings for maintenance access allowed gases to seep upward into occupied spaces. Carbon monoxide, as we've discussed in previous segments, is denser than air and odorless, giving no warning. But under certain conditions, it can rise, particularly when warmed, as it would be in a hypocaust chamber. The gas would seep up through floor gaps, accumulating at floor level in the rooms above. People sleeping on the floor or sitting in low chairs would be the first affected. The recorded incidents of hypocaust-related deaths follow a predictable pattern. Someone, often a monk or servant, would be found dead or unconscious near the heated floor. Sometimes multiple people would be affected simultaneously. The deaths often occurred during cold weather, when the furnace was being run at maximum output, and when windows and doors were sealed against the cold, preventing natural ventilation that might have dispersed the carbon monoxide. Medieval records describe these deaths in terms that clearly indicate carbon monoxide poisoning, though the observers didn't understand what they were seeing. Victims were described as having been healthy when they went to sleep and dead by morning, with no signs of violence or obvious illness. Some were found in confused or stupor states, unable to explain what was wrong. Bodies sometimes showed the characteristic cherry-red color of carbon monoxide poisoning, which confused medieval observers. Why would a corpse be flushed rather than pale? The danger wasn't limited to the occupied rooms. The monks or servants who tended the furnace and maintained the hypocaust system were at even greater risk. Entering the hypocaust chamber for maintenance to clean flues, repair pillar supports, or clear blockages meant descending into a space that might contain lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide. The gas could accumulate to extraordinary levels in these confined spaces. Modern safety standards consider 50 parts per million ppm of carbon monoxide to be the maximum safe exposure for continuous occupancy. At 200 ppm, slight headaches occur within 2 to 3 hours. At 800 ppm, dizziness, nausea, and convulsions occur within 45 minutes. Unconsciousness within 2 hours. At 1600 ppm, headache and dizziness occur within 20 minutes. Death within 1 hour. In a poorly vented hypocaust chamber, concentrations could exceed 5000 ppm, deadly within minutes. A maintenance worker descending into such a space would quickly become confused and disoriented, unable to recognize danger or escape. If they collapsed in the chamber, they would die of asphyxiation, while anyone nearby would be unaware. The worker simply wouldn't emerge, and by the time someone went to investigate, it would be too late. These dangers led to the prohibition of hypocaust systems in many jurisdictions, or to strict regulations about their construction and operation. Authorities recognized that while the technology offered advantages, the risks were too great, especially given that safer, if less efficient, alternatives existed. A fireplace might be less comfortable, but it was unlikely to silently kill everyone in the room overnight. The regulations that emerged show sophisticated understanding of the hazards, even without modern scientific knowledge. Some rules required hypocaust furnaces to be located at significant distances from occupied buildings, with long underground flues to carry heat. This reduced the concentration of combustion gases entering the hypocaust chamber. Others mandated multiple ventilation flues, providing redundancy in case one became blocked. Some required regular inspection and cleaning of the system, with penalties for neglect. Perhaps most interesting were regulations requiring that hypocaust chambers be accessible from outside the building, with entrance passages designed to allow natural ventilation before anyone entered. This was an early example of confined space entry procedures, ensuring adequate ventilation before human entry. Some regulations specified that no one should enter a hypocaust chamber alone, and that ropes should be used so that an unconscious worker could be pulled out without anyone else descending into the potentially lethal environment. The physics of carbon monoxide accumulation in confined spaces is straightforward but deadly. In a sealed or poorly ventilated space, combustion rapidly depletes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide, being denser than air, pools at the lowest levels. Carbon monoxide, with a density similar to air, distributes more evenly, but both gases displace oxygen, creating an atmosphere that cannot support life. A person entering such an environment might take a few breaths before recognizing something was wrong, but recognition would come too late. The first breath of high-concentration carbon monoxide begins the process of hemoglobin binding. Within seconds, oxygen delivery to the brain begins to falter. Confusion and disorientation set in almost immediately. The victim might try to escape but become lost or disoriented in the dark underground space, or they might simply collapse, unconscious within a minute, dead within a few minutes more. Modern confined space safety protocols exist because people died learning these lessons. Medieval regulations around hypocaust access represent an earlier version of the same hard-won knowledge. The regulations saved some lives, but not all the incentives to cut corners, to skip expensive maintenance, or to rush a repair were always present, and they sometimes led to predictable tragedies. The eventual abandonment of hypocaust technology in medieval Europe wasn't solely due to safety concerns. The systems were expensive to build and maintain, required skilled craftsmen who understood their operation, and consumed substantial fuel. As labor costs rose and fuel became more expensive, the economics became less favorable. Simpler heating methods, fireplaces, and eventually stoves could be built and operated more cheaply, even if they provided less comfortable heat. But safety concerns certainly contributed to the decline. After several well-publicized deaths from hypocaust failures, the technology acquired a dangerous reputation. Potential builders had to weigh the comfort benefits against the risk that their expensive installation might kill people. Many decided the risk wasn't worth it. In a few locations, hypercost systems continued to operate into the early modern period, maintained by people with deep knowledge of their safe operation. The Roman baths at Bath, England, continued to use hypercost technology for centuries. Some continental monasteries maintained their systems into the 16th or 17th centuries, but these were increasingly rare exceptions. The knowledge of how to safely build and operate hypercost systems was gradually lost. By the 18th century, when antiquarians began seriously studying Roman technology, hypocausts were mysterious ruins, their purpose not immediately obvious to observers who had no living tradition of their use. When modern radiant floor heating was developed in the early 20th century, it was largely reinvented, rather than being a continuation of the ancient tradition. The modern version of radiant floor heating avoids the carbon monoxide hazard by using hot water circulating through pipes rather than hot air from combustion. The boiler that heats the water is located outside the living space, with its combustion products safely vented. The system provides the same even, comfortable heat that the Romans achieved, but without the deadly risk of carbon monoxide accumulation. Looking back at medieval hypocaust systems through the lens of modern knowledge, we can see both remarkable engineering sophistication and dangerous gaps in understanding. The thermodynamic principles were sound. Radiant floor heating is genuinely superior to point source heating for comfort and efficiency. The construction techniques were impressive, creating durable systems that could function for centuries. But the lack of understanding about combustion products and gas behavior created a fatal vulnerability. The story of hypercost bans illustrates how technological advancement isn't linear. Sometimes a sophisticated technology is abandoned in favor of simpler, safer alternatives, even if those alternatives are, in some ways, inferior. The hypercost was more efficient and more comfortable than a fireplace, but fireplaces didn't silently fill rooms with invisible poison gas. The trade-off seemed clear, especially after a few high-profile deaths. This pattern repeats throughout technological history. Nuclear power is more efficient and produces less CO than coal, but the catastrophic failure scenarios have limited its adoption. Early aircraft were faster than trains or ships, but the death rate was so high that many people chose slower, safer transportation. Self-driving cars may eventually be safer than human drivers, but early accidents create hesitation about adoption. In each case, the comparison isn't just about average performance, but about worst-case scenarios and risk tolerance. A heating system that works brilliantly 99% of the time, but kills people the other 1% is not an acceptable technology, regardless of its advantages. Medieval authorities, lacking our modern risk assessment frameworks, arrived at the same conclusion through bitter experience. Some technologies are too dangerous to permit, regardless of their benefits. The monks who died tending their monasteries, hypocaust; the workers who collapsed in the underground chambers. Their deaths informed the regulations that followed, regulations that ultimately led to the abandonment of a technology that would be safely replicated for nearly 1,000 years. Segment 6. The Alchemists' furnace expanded. In the shadowy workshops of medieval Europe, where the boundaries between science, mysticism, and fraud blurred into indistinction, alchemists pursued the most ambitious goals imaginable: the transmutation of base metals into gold, the creation of the philosopher's stone, the discovery of the elixir of life. These pursuits required heat-sustained, precise, controllable heat at temperatures that ordinary hearths and furnaces couldn't reliably maintain. The alchemical furnace, therefore, became not just a tool but the very heart of the alchemical enterprise, a device that embodied centuries of accumulated knowledge about combustion, materials, and thermodynamics. But these furnaces, for all their sophistication, were also instruments of death. Their enclosed designs that concentrated heat also made them producers of toxic fumes on a scale that could poison entire neighborhoods. The alchemical furnace evolved over many centuries, drawing on traditions from ancient Egypt, Greece, the Islamic world, and Chinese metallurgy. By the medieval period, the design had reached a high level of sophistication. The classic alchemical furnace, as described in texts like the works of Jabir ibn Hayyan, or the later European compilations, was a marvel of engineering that modern combustion engineers can appreciate. The basic structure consisted of multiple chambers stacked vertically. At the bottom was the fire chamber, where fuel, typically charcoal, was burned. Above this was the combustion chamber, where the hot gases from the fire were mixed with air from carefully designed vents to achieve optimal combustion. Above that was the work chamber, where the alchemical vessels containing the materials being processed were placed. The entire structure was built of firebrick or similar refractory materials that could withstand sustained high temperatures without cracking or degrading. Unlike a simple fire where fuel is added haphazardly and airflow is unregulated, the alchemical furnace used a sophisticated arrangement of vents, dampers, and flues to precisely control both fuel delivery and oxygen supply. This allowed the operator to maintain specific temperatures for days or even weeks, essential for alchemical processes that required long periods of sustained heating. Some furnaces incorporated bellows systems to increase air supply when higher temperatures were needed. The bellows might be operated manually, by foot pedals, or in the most advanced workshops, by water wheels that provided continuous mechanical power. The thermodynamic principles at work in these furnaces aligned closely with modern combustion engineering. Complete combustion of carbon charcoal requires precise stoichiometric ratios, approximately 2.7 grams of oxygen for every gram of carbon burned. Too little oxygen, and you get incomplete combustion, producing carbon monoxide and soot. Too much oxygen, and you waste heat, carrying away the excess. The ideal combustion produces the maximum heat with minimal waste products. Medieval alchemists didn't understand chemistry in modern terms. The oxygen theory of combustion wouldn't be established until the late 18th century, but they understood empirically that controlling airflow controlled both temperature and the nature of the combustion. The precision of temperature control achievable in a well-designed alchemical furnace was remarkable. Texts describe maintaining specific heats for particular processes. The dung heat, very gentle warmth, like fermenting manure. The bath heat, the temperature of hot bath water. The vapor heat, enough to vaporize water, and progressing through increasingly intense heats, up to the fusion heat capable of melting metals. The very features that made alchemical furnaces so effective, their efficiency, their ability to maintain high temperatures. Their enclosed designs also made them extraordinarily dangerous, particularly in urban environments. This created resentment among ordinary residents, who found their heating fuel becoming less available because alchemists were consuming it for their mysterious experiments. And to understand those dangers, we need to understand what medieval alchemists were actually doing in their workshops. Alchemy wasn't simply about heating metals in hopes of transformation. It involved complex chemical processes. Distillation, calcination, heating in air to produce oxides, sublimation, direct conversion from solid to vapor, amalgamation combining metals with mercury, and numerous other operations. Mercury, or quicksilver as it was known, was central to much alchemical work. When mercury is heated, it vaporizes at a relatively low temperature, -674 degrees Fahrenheit, 357 grados, easily achievable in an alchemical furnace. Mercury vapor is invisible, odorless, and devastatingly toxic. The toxicology of mercury is complex and horrible. Elemental mercury vapor, when inhaled, is absorbed almost entirely into the bloodstream through the lungs. Once in the blood, it crosses the blood-brain barrier easily, accumulating in the brain and central nervous system. There it interferes with numerous cellular processes, particularly those involving enzymes dependent on sulfhydryl groups. The symptoms of mercury poisoning develop gradually with chronic exposure. Early signs include tremors, particularly of the hands, the characteristic hatter's shakes later associated with hat makers who used mercury compounds in their trade. Personality changes follow: irritability, depression, anxiety, and emotional instability. Eventually, severe cases develop kidney damage, peripheral neuropathy, and sometimes death. Medieval alchemists, working day after day in workshops filled with mercury vapor from their heating operations, were slowly poisoning themselves. The tremors, the erratic behavior, the mental deterioration, these became almost stereotypical characteristics of alchemists, depicted in art and literature as trembling, wild-eyed eccentrics. But this wasn't inherent to the personality type drawn to alchemy. It was mercury poisoning, the occupational disease of the trade. But mercury was only one of the toxic metals alchemists worked with. Lead was extensively used, both as a material for transmutation experiments and as a component in glazes for alchemical vessels. When lead is heated to high temperatures, as it would be in alchemical operations, it can vaporize. Lead poisoning operates differently from mercury poisoning, but is equally devastating. Lead interferes with numerous enzyme systems in the body, but particularly affects the synthesis of heme, the iron-containing part of hemoglobin. Lead also affects the nervous system, particularly in children, causing developmental delays, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems. Adults experience peripheral neuropathy, kidney damage, and reproductive problems. The symptoms of lead poisoning were well known in medieval times, though the mechanism wasn't understood. Arsenic was another common alchemical material. Various arsenic compounds were used in attempts to color or modify metals, and arsenic was believed to have important properties in the alchemical work. When arsenic compounds are heated, they can release arsenic trioxide vapor, white arsenic, one of history's most famous poisons. Arsenic trioxide is acutely toxic at remarkably low doses. Just 100 to 200 milligrams can be fatal to an adult, but chronic low-level exposure, the kind that might result from living near an alchemical workshop, has its own constellation of effects. Skin changes, including hyperpigmentation and hyperkeratosis, peripheral neuropathy, increased cancer risk, particularly of the skin, bladder, and lungs, and cardiovascular disease. Medieval poisoning cases often involved arsenic because it was readily available, and its symptoms could mimic natural illness. But the chronic low-level poisoning from environmental exposure to alchemical arsenic vapor was probably far more common than deliberate poisoning, affecting dozens or hundreds of people who had no idea they were being exposed to a deadly toxin. Beyond these heavy metals, alchemical processes produced a host of other toxic compounds. Sulfur, used extensively in alchemical work, would produce sulfur dioxide when heated. We've already discussed its respiratory effects. Sulfur combined with metals could produce metal sulfides, which decompose when heated to release hydrogen sulfide. The characteristic rotten egg smell that's toxic at high concentrations. Various alchemical operations produced nitrogen oxides, chlorine gas when sal ammoniac was heated with certain acids, carbon monoxide from incomplete combustion, and a bewildering array of organic vapors from the distillation of plant materials and animal products that alchemists sometimes worked with. The cumulative effect of all these emissions from a single alchemical workshop was bad enough. But in medieval cities, there might be multiple alchemists operating, each with their own furnaces, each producing their own toxic plume. The air quality in certain districts became abysmal, with visible hazes from particulate matter and distinctive chemical smells permeating the air. The Prague incident of 1389, mentioned in the original segment, was actually one of many poisoning events associated with alchemical workshops, but it's particularly well documented. Prague in the late 14th century was a center of learning and alchemy, attracting practitioners from across Europe. The city's castle district housed numerous alchemical workshops, some operating under royal patronage. Contemporary accounts describe a mass illness in several neighborhoods near the castle in the summer of 1389. Dozens of people became ill with similar symptoms: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, followed in severe cases by kidney failure and death. Children and the elderly were particularly affected. The city's physicians, investigating the outbreak, noted that the pattern of illness clustered around certain streets, specifically streets downhill and downwind from the alchemical workshops. The investigation focused on the water supply, as many poisoning events manifested through contaminated water. What they discovered was that the heavy metal vapors from the alchemical furnaces, primarily lead and arsenic compounds, were condensing on cool surfaces, roofs, walls, and most critically, on the inside of cisterns where rainwater was collected for drinking. In medieval cities, many households collected rainwater from roofs into cisterns, particularly in areas where well water was scarce or of poor quality. The ban wasn't absolute. Some alchemical work was permitted under strict licensing, with requirements for waste disposal, limits on the materials that could be used, and mandatory inspections. But the era of unregulated alchemical workshops in the heart of the city was over. Similar bans followed in other cities across Europe, though with varying degrees of stringency and enforcement. The alchemists themselves resisted these regulations, often vigorously. They argued that their work was essential, that they were on the verge of great discoveries that would benefit all of humanity, that the restrictions would drive alchemy, the economic activity and prestige it brought to other cities. These arguments had some weight, particularly in cities that prided themselves on being centers of learning, but the public health evidence was overwhelming. The correlation between alchemical workshops and illness in nearby populations was too clear to ignore. The contamination of water sources posed risks not just to immediate neighbors but to entire districts. The fuel consumption strained resources during periods of scarcity, and perhaps most problematically, the secretive nature of alchemical work made it difficult for authorities to assess and regulate the risks. Alchemists, paranoid about having their techniques stolen, were notoriously reluctant to disclose what they were actually doing. The scientific validity of alchemical theories is, from a modern perspective, obviously questionable. The transmutation of lead into gold through heating and combination with various reagents is chemically impossibly. Identity of an element is determined by the number of protons in its nucleus, and chemical processes cannot change that. But regardless of whether the theoretical goals of alchemy were achievable, the furnace technology that alchemists developed was genuinely sophisticated and influential. The design principles of alchemical furnaces, controlled combustion, efficient heat transfer, precise temperature regulation, would influence the development of industrial furnaces for metallurgy, ceramics, and chemical manufacturing. The distillation apparatus that alchemists used would evolve into the equipment used for petroleum refining and chemical synthesis. The careful observation and documentation of material changes under different conditions was a precursor to modern experimental chemistry. Several important figures in the development of modern chemistry were trained as alchemists or studied alchemical texts. Robert Boyle, who formulated fundamental gas laws, Antoine Lavoisier, who established the oxygen theory of combustion, and many others drew on the accumulated empirical knowledge of alchemy, even as they rejected its theoretical framework. But the toxic legacy of alchemical practice shouldn't be minimized. Analysis of bones from medieval alchemists, identified in graves through associated tools and materials, shows extraordinarily high levels of mercury, lead, and arsenic concentrations that would be considered medical emergencies in living people. These individuals were literally saturated with heavy metals, their bones serving as repositories for toxins their bodies couldn't eliminate. The environmental contamination around former alchemical sites persists even today. Archaeological excavations of medieval alchemical workshops regularly find soil contaminated with mercury, lead, and arsenic at levels that require special handling and disposal. The toxic residues from centuries-old alchemical operations remain hazardous nearly a millennium later, a testament to the durability of heavy metal pollution. Modern alchemical historians and enthusiasts sometimes attempt to recreate historical alchemical processes, and those who do so responsibly take extensive safety precautions, working in well-ventilated spaces, using fume hoods, wearing protective equipment, carefully disposing of toxic wastes. These precautions highlight just how dangerous historical alchemical practice must have been, conducted as it was in poorly ventilated medieval workshops with no protective equipment and no understanding of the invisible dangers being created. The regulations and bans on alchemical furnaces represent an early example of technology, assessment and regulation based on unintended consequences. The alchemists weren't trying to poison their neighbors, they were pursuing what they believed to be legitimate scientific and philosophical goals. In each case, the challenge is balancing potential benefits against potential harms, making decisions with incomplete information, and protecting the public while not unnecessarily restricting valuable innovation. The alchemists of medieval Prague and other cities were genuinely pursuing knowledge, and some of their work contributed to humanity's understanding of materials and chemical processes, but they were also, however unintentionally, poisoning their neighbors, contaminating water supplies, and creating environmental hazards that would persist for centuries. We have regulations, safety equipment, and monitoring systems that allow dangerous chemical work to be conducted with acceptable levels of risk. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we pursue knowledge and capability while protecting ourselves and our communities from the hazards that such pursuits can create? The banned alchemical furnaces of medieval Europe are early chapters in that ongoing negotiation. Segment 7. The Peat Paradox Expanded. Across the windswept bogs of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, a remarkable substance lay just beneath the surface peat. Layer upon layer of partially decomposed plant material accumulated over thousands of years in waterlogged conditions where decay proceeds slowly and incompletely. To the people living in these regions, particularly those in areas where forests were sparse or absent, peat represented salvation, an abundant, easily accessible fuel that required no elaborate mining operation, no expensive transportation from distant sources. You simply cut it from the bog, dried it in the wind and sun, and burned it to keep your family warm and your food cooked. But peat smoke carried its own particular hazards that manifested slowly over years and decades of exposure, making them difficult to connect with their cause. The story of peat burning in medieval Scotland and Ireland is a story of environmental adaptation, of making do with what nature provided, and of paying a price in health that would not be fully understood, until modern medical science could explain what medieval physicians could only observe. Peat develops in wetlands, bogs, fens, and mires where plants grow, die, and fall into standing water. The weight of newer material on top compresses older material below, squeezing out water and further concentrating the organic matter. This makes it chemically intermediate between wood, which is fresher plant material, and lignite coal, which is more thoroughly compressed and aged. Medieval peat burners were, in a sense, accelerating that geological process, using millions of years of stored solar energy to heat their homes. At this moisture level, it won't burn at outlawed, expend more energy evaporating the water than you gain from combusting the organic material. The practice of peat cutting developed into a sophisticated craft in regions where it was common. Peat was typically cut in spring or early summer, allowing maximum drying time before winter. The cutting technique varied by region, but generally involved using a special spade called a slane in Ireland, or a similar implement to cut blocks or bricks of peat from vertical faces in the bog. After initial drying, it would be restacked in larger formations, some quite elaborate that shed rain while continuing to allow airflow. The entire process from cutting to having fuel ready for burning might take 3 to 6 months, requiring careful timing and considerable labor. But once dried, peat was an excellent fuel in many respects. It could be stored almost indefinitely if kept dry. It burned with a steady, moderate heat, not as intensely as coal or charcoal, but more evenly than wood. The characteristics of peat combustion, however, created the health hazards that would eventually lead to restrictions. Peat burns differently from wood in several important ways. First, because it's already partially decomposed, the volatile compounds that give wood smoke its characteristic smell have largely been driven off during peat formation. Where wood has distinct cellular structures that burn in an organized way, peat is a matrix of partially decomposed material with high surface area relative to volume. When it burns, it produces large quantities of tiny ash particles that become entrained in the smoke. But the quantity of particles is only part of the problem. The chemical composition of the particles is equally concerning. In the respiratory tract, phenolic compounds in inhaled smoke cause inflammation and cellular damage. Chronic exposure leads to progressive scarring of lung tissue, reducing lung capacity and flexibility. This scarring, called fibrosis, is irreversible once lung tissue is damaged and scarred. It doesn't recover. The symptoms of chronic peat smoke exposure were well known in medieval Scotland and Ireland, even if the mechanism wasn't understood. Physicians and healers described what they called the peat cough, a chronic, productive cough that developed in people who spent years in peat smoke-filled homes. It produced brownish or blackish sputum, literally the person's lungs attempting to expel the accumulated particulates and damaged cells. They would breathe more rapidly at rest, their bodies attempting to compensate for reduced lung capacity. The right ventricle of the heart, which pumps blood to the lungs, has to work harder when the lungs are damaged and can't efficiently oxygenate blood. Over time, the heart muscle weakens and fails. Medieval medical texts describe these progression with remarkable accuracy, even without modern diagnostic tools. They noted that the condition was most common among those who tended hearth fires, typically women and elderly, people who spent long hours indoors near the fire. The skeletal evidence from medieval Scottish and Irish populations confirms the prevalence of chronic respiratory disease. Analysis of ribs from burial sites in peat-burning regions shows characteristic changes, thickened rib bones from chronic inflammation and remodeling. These skeletal markers of respiratory disease appear at higher frequencies in peat-burning populations than in contemporaneous populations from wood-burning regions. Beyond the particulate matter and phenolic compounds, peat combustion produces another class of dangerous chemicals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAUs, which we discussed earlier in the context of dung burning. PAHs are formed when any organic material undergoes incomplete combustion at moderate temperatures, exactly the conditions that prevail in a typical peat fire. The carcinogenic properties of PAs mean that chronic exposure to peat smoke increases cancer risk. The medieval connection between peat smoke and what we would now recognize as cancer was understood. The disease concept of cancer as we know it would be fully developed until the 19th century, but medieval physicians did describe lingering wasting diseases that consumed the lungs of long-term peat burners. The monastic restrictions on peat burning in sleeping quarters, mentioned in the original segment, represent an early application of harm reduction principles. Monasteries were sophisticated organizations with considerable accumulated knowledge about health and disease. Monks copied and studied classical medical texts, and they added their own observations from caring for sick members of their communities. Monks who observed that brothers sleeping in peat smoke-filled rooms developed chronic coughs and lung diseases more frequently than those sleeping in cleaner air made a logical connection. The solution was practical: ban peat fires in sleeping areas. Dormitories would be unheated, or heated by other means, perhaps by warmth rising from rooms below, or by better ventilated fires in adjoining spaces. Yes, this meant monks would be colder at night, but cold, while uncomfortable, was survivable. Some monasteries developed early chimney systems specifically for peat burning. The principle, empirically discovered, was that peat smoke needed more vigorous updraft than wood smoke to be effectively removed. Peat smoke is cooler than wood smoke. In areas where peat was the primary or exclusive fuel part of the Scottish Highlands, but in regions where multiple fuels were available and people could choose between peat, wood, and eventually coal, interesting patterns emerged. Poorer households burned peat exclusively because it was what they could afford, and they suffered the health consequences disproportionately. This created another example of environmental health inequality, similar to what we saw with coal and dung burning. Children growing up in poor households breathing peat smoke from infancy developed permanent lung damage that would affect their health throughout their lives, reducing their working capacity and likely shortening their lifespans. The developmental effects of chronic smoke exposure on children are particularly tragic. This creates a vicious cycle. Children with impaired lung development are less able to perform physical labor as adults, limiting their economic prospects and likely ensuring that they in turn will burn cheap peat fuel and expose their own children to the same hazards. The chemical complexity of peat smoke continues to reveal new concerns, even in modern analysis. Recent studies have identified dioxins and furans in peat smoke, chlorinated, organic compounds that are among the most toxic substances known. These compounds form when organic material containing chlorine from plant uptake of chloride salts from groundwater undergoes combustion. Medieval peat burners, of course, had no way to detect or measure dioxins, but they were there, in the smoke, being inhaled with every breath, accumulating in body tissues. Other bogs contribute uranium, thorium, or other radioactive elements that accumulate in certain types of wetland plants. The variability of peat composition from bog to bog meant that some peat was more dangerous than others. Medieval users, lacking analytical tools, couldn't determine which bogs produced safer fuel. They might notice that peat from certain sources seemed to produce more illness, but they couldn't systematically identify and avoid hazardous sources. Despite these hazards, peat remained essential in many regions simply because alternatives weren't available or affordable. For these communities, peat smoke was not a choice between safe and unsafe. Option Z was a choice between smoke exposure and freezing to death, between respiratory disease in middle age and immediate death from cold. This impossible choice explains why peat burning continued even after its health effects were well documented. You cannot ban people's only source of heat and expect them to survive. The expansion of coal mining and distribution made coal available even in remote areas. The development of more efficient stoves, which burned fuel more completely and produced less smoke, reduced exposure even when peat continued to be used. Better housing, with improved ventilation and chimneys, allowed smoke to be removed more effectively. But these improvements came slowly, and in the meantime, generations of people breathed peat smoke daily, developing the characteristic chronic cough, the shortness of breath, the progressive lung damage. Modern Ireland and Scotland still have cultural memory of peat burning, though it's now largely a choice of tradition rather than necessity. Some people maintain turf-cutting rights on traditional family bogs and burn peat for the smell and the connection to heritage. Tourist sites sometimes demonstrate traditional peat cutting and burning, but these are carefully managed, limited exposures, nothing like the continuous, heavy smoke exposure that medieval peat burners experienced. And unique ecosystems that we now recognize as valuable beyond their fuel potential. With modern knowledge, we can see clearly what they could only dimly perceive, that the smoke swirling through their cottages was slowly damaging their lungs, that the soot blackening their walls was also blackening their lung tissue, that the cough they accepted as normal was actually a symptom of progressive disease. We can measure the particulates, identify the toxic compounds, quantify the health risks, and we can make different choices, using cleaner fuels, better combustion technology, and improved ventilation to reduce the health burden of heating our homes. But for medieval Scotland and Ireland, burning peat was simply what you did. It was as fundamental to survival as growing crops or raising livestock. The health costs were real, but so was the cold that would kill you far more quickly than smoke would. In that context, the peat paradox wasn't really a paradox. At all, it was a grim but rational calculation, accepting certain future harm to prevent immediate death. Segment 8. The tallow trap expanded. Tallow, rendered fat from cattle and sheep, was a byproduct of butchering, produced in large quantities and often treated as waste or relegated to making cheap candles and soap. But when placed in specially designed braziers or added to existing fires, tallow produced intense heat, supplementing wood or coal and stretching fuel budgets during harsh winters. The thermodynamic logic was impeccable. Fats contain approximately 9 kilocalories per gram of energy, more than twice the energy density of carbohydrates or proteins at 4 kilocalories per gram. Wealthy households produced substantial quantities of tallow as a natural consequence of their meat consumption. A medieval noble household might slaughter a cow weighing 801,000 pounds, yielding perhaps 80 to 100 pounds of fat, rendered into tallow. This represented a significant quantity of potential fuel. Similarly, sheep consumed in large numbers contributed their fat to the household's tallow supply. Kitchen waste fat from cooking could be collected, clarified, and added to the fuel stock. The practice of tallow burning appears to have developed first in monastic communities and noble households institutions with sophisticated kitchens that produced large quantities of meat waste and that could afford to experiment with novel heating methods. The earliest references appear in Italian and French sources from the 13th century, describing special furnaces or braziers designed specifically for burning tallow and other animal fats. These specialized burners were necessary because tallow presents combustion challenges that wood or coal don't. Tallow is solid at room temperature melting point around Pa-122 degrees Fahrenheit or Y-50 degrees Celsius, but liquefies when heated. In a simple fire, solid tallow would melt, flow away from the heat source, and potentially spread burning liquid across floors. An obvious fire hazard. The specialized tallow burners addressed this by using containers that would hold the melted fat while allowing it to burn in a controlled manner. The design typically involved a metal basin or crucible, suspended over or surrounded by the main fire. As the tallow in the crucible melted, it would form a pool of liquid fat. A wick, similar to but larger than a candle wick, would draw the liquid tallow upward by capillary action, where it would vaporize and burn at the flame. The heat from this burning would maintain the tallow in a liquid state, creating a self-sustaining cycle. More sophisticated designs incorporated multiple wicks or used forced air from bellows to increase combustion intensity. The most elaborate tallow burners, developed in wealthy Venetian households in the 14th century, were engineering marvels that could maintain steady heat output for hours. The heat produced by tallow combustion is indeed intense. When burning efficiently, tallow can produce flame temperatures exceeding to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,1 graus Celsius, hotter than wood fires, and comparable to coal. This intense heat made tallow attractive not just for space heating, but for applications requiring high temperatures, such as certain metalworking operations or glass melting. Acrolein forms when the glycerol backbone of triglyceride molecules Acrolein is one of the most viciously irritating substances known. Medieval descriptions of tallow burning incidents consistently describe these symptoms, though the writers didn't know they were describing acrolein exposure. What they were experiencing was acute acrolein poisoning from incomplete tallow combustion. Tallow consists primarily of triglycerides molecules with 3 fatty acid chains attached to a glycerol backbone. But the glycerol backbone more readily decomposes to acrolein, especially under oxygen-poor conditions. But the health consequences are anything but simple. Acrolein is not just an irritant, it's also toxic to cells, causing direct damage to the tissues it contacts. Chronic exposure can cause permanent scarring of respiratory tissues and has been linked to increased cancer risk. Beyond acrolein, incomplete tallow combustion produces a complex mixture of other toxic compounds, ketones and aldehydes of various chain lengths, formed from the breakdown of fatty acid chains, contribute to the choking smell and irritating properties of tallow smoke. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, POS, those persistent carcinogens we've encountered in other combustion scenarios, form when any organic material burns incompletely, and tallow combustion produces them in abundance. The particulate matter from tallow combustion is particularly problematic because it consists largely of condensed fat droplets, essentially aerosolized grease. These tiny droplets, often in the respirable size range, less than 10 micrometers in diameter, can penetrate deep into the lungs. Unlike solid particles, which the lungs can sometimes clear through mucociliary action, liquid fat droplets can coat lung surfaces, interfere with gas exchange, and cause a condition called lipoid pneumonia. Inflammation and scarring of lung tissue caused by lipid fat deposits Cases of lipoid pneumonia appear in medieval medical texts. Though not identified as such, the disease concept wouldn't be named until the 20th century. But descriptions of lung ailments characterized by oily sputum, progressive breathing difficulty, and resistance to normal treatments appear in medical compilations from regions and periods where tallow burning was common. Modern pathologists, reading these descriptions, recognize the classic presentation of lipoid pneumonia. But perhaps the most dramatic and dangerous hazard from tallow burning was the risk of grease fires. When tallow burners malfunctioned, a common occurrence, given the crude materials and imperfect understanding of combustion dynamics, the results could be catastrophic. The specific danger of grease fires lies in the density and water content of burning fat. Tallow, when liquid and burning, has a temperature well above the boiling point of water. The burning surface is typically HA-700 degrees Fahrenheit or AC-370 degrees Celsius. If water contacts burning tallow, it instantly vaporizes, expanding to roughly 1,700 times its liquid volume. This explosive expansion atomizes the burning fat, creating a fireball and scattering burning droplets across a wide area. This is why water makes grease fires worse, not better. The historical accounts of tallow burning disasters consistently mention this phenomenon. Though medieval observers didn't understand the underlying physics, they knew empirically that throwing water on a tallow fire caused an explosion of flame, but they couldn't explain why. Some attributed it to supernatural causes, demonic intervention in the fire, or to fundamental incompatibility between the elements of water and fire. The reality is straightforward physics and chemistry. Rapid vaporization creates explosive force, and burning fat particles, being less dense than water, float on water's surface and spread across it. When burning tallow spilled on a medieval wooden floor and someone threw water on it, the water would simply spread the burning fat across a wider area, while the vaporization created a temporary fireball. The resulting conflagration could engulf an entire room in seconds. Numerous fatal fires in medieval Venice, London, Paris, and other cities were attributed to tallow burners. The most thoroughly documented is a fire in Venice in 1320 that destroyed a palazzo belonging to the Contarini family, killing 7 people and consuming several adjacent buildings before being brought under control. The investigation revealed that the fire started when a tallow burner overturned, spilling burning fat onto a wooden floor. Servants attempted to extinguish it with water, which spread the fire explosively. The wooden structure, with its ample supply of flammable materials, went up rapidly. This incident, and others like it, led Venetian authorities to ban indoor tallow burning in 1321, with severe penalties for violations. Other Italian city-states followed suit. The ban spread northward through Europe over the following decades, though enforcement varied by jurisdiction and violations were common. The wealthy households that used tallow burners argued against the bans, claiming that they could afford proper equipment and precautions that made the practice safe. There was some truth to this. The most sophisticated tallow burners, properly operated by trained servants and equipped with safety features, were relatively safe. But the bans were driven by concerns about fire risk to neighboring properties and to the city as a whole, not just to the household operating the burner. A tallow fire in one building could easily spread to adjacent structures, particularly in medieval cities, where buildings were often built directly against each other, with shared walls. The externality problem, where one household's risky behavior imposes costs on others, justified collective regulation through bans. The chemistry of tallow combustion also explains another hazard: the production of extremely thick, sooty smoke when combustion is incomplete. Fats, with their high carbon and hydrogen content, require substantial oxygen for complete combustion. The stoichiometric equation for complete combustion of a typical triglyceride requires approximately 2.8 grams of oxygen for every gram of fat burned. In practical terms, this means a tallow burner needs much more airflow than a wood fire of equivalent heat output. Medieval burners, with their primitive air supply systems, often couldn't provide adequate oxygen. The result was heavy black smoke laden with unburned carbon particles, organic compounds, and acrolein. This smoke was so thick and irritating that it could render rooms uninhabitable. The soot deposition from tallow burning was also problematic. The smoke would condense on cool surface walls, ceilings, furniture, leaving sticky, greasy deposits that were difficult to clean and that accumulated layers of dirt. Rooms where tallow was regularly burned developed characteristic black streaks on walls and ceilings. evidence of years of incomplete combustion. Some wealthy households attempted to address these problems through technological innovations. They built special rooms for tallow burning, isolated from living spaces, with elaborate ventilation systems. They developed better burner designs with forced air systems. They experimented with mixing tallow with other materials to modify its burning characteristics, shading beeswax to raise the melting point, or lamp oil to make it burn more cleanly. These experiments had mixed success. Beeswax, while it did raise the melting point and could reduce spillage risk, was expensive far more so than the tallow it was supposed to improve. Using beeswax in such quantities defeated the economic purpose of burning tallow in the first place. Lamp oil, typically olive oil or fish oil, did make tallow burn somewhat more cleanly, but it also increased the fire hazard if the burner failed. The ultimate failure of tallow burning as a heating method wasn't due solely to the hazards, though those were certainly significant. It was also due to economics. As urban populations grew and meat consumption increased, tallow became valuable for other purposes. The soap-making industry, rapidly expanding in the 14th and 15th centuries, competed for tallow supplies. So did the candle-making industry, particularly after improved candle designs made tallow candles more acceptable for lighting wealthy households. When tallow could be sold to soap makers or candle makers at good prices, burning it for heat, even with its high energy content, became economically irrational. You could sell the tallow and buy wood or coal that burned more safely and cleanly. The marginal value of tallow as a commodity exceeded its value as fuel, and market forces accomplished what bans alone might not have: the end of tallow burning as a common heating practice. But the legacy of tallow burning persisted in several ways. The technological development of controlled liquid fuel burners, primitive as they were in medieval tallow burners, would eventually contribute to the development of oil lamps, kerosene heaters, and modern oil furnaces. The hard lessons about grease fire hazards would inform fire safety practices and regulations for centuries, and the recognition that some fuels, regardless of their energy content, are simply too dangerous for common use in populated areas would shape energy policy development. Modern fire safety training still emphasizes the dangers of grease fires and the rule to never use water on them. The physics hasn't changed. Burning fat and water still create explosive vaporization and flame spread. We now use Class K fire extinguishers, wet chemical systems specifically designed for grease fires, or simply smother them with lids or fire blankets. But the underlying hazard, the one that medieval Venetian servants discovered so catastrophically in 1320, remains exactly the same. The tallow trap, the tempting idea that waste fat could be an excellent heating fuel, caught many medieval households. The energy content was real, the availability was real, and in theory it should have worked. But the hidden dangers of Crowleyan production, grease fire hazards, lipoid pneumonia from fat aerosols, explosive interaction with water made it ultimately unsustainable. The bans that authorities imposed, initially resisted by wealthy households who could afford the technology and precautions, were ultimately vindicated by experience and eventually accepted even by those who had fought them. 7 centuries later, we understand exactly why tallow burning was so dangerous. We can write the chemical equations, measure the toxic compounds, predict the combustion behavior, and quantify the fire risk. Medieval authorities couldn't do any of that, but they didn't need to. They could see cause and effect. Tallow burners caused terrible fires, sickened people with their smoke, and created unacceptable risks to the urban fabric. That was sufficient evidence for action, and history has proven them right. Segment 9. The bonfire controversy expanded. Among the most disturbing yet economically rational fuel choices made by medieval Europe's poorest inhabitants was the burning of bones, animal skeletons from butchering operations, fish bones from markets, and occasionally, in the grimmest circumstances, human bones from charnel houses and plague pits. The very word bonfire, still in common use today, derives from this medieval practice. Bonfire, literal fires, fueled by skeletal remains. What began as a practical use of waste material evolved into a practice so controversial that it engaged medical, theological, and civil authorities in debates that would ultimately lead to widespread prohibition. To understand why anyone would burn bones for fuel, we must first understand the material reality of medieval urban life. Cities generated enormous quantities of organic waste. Butchers produced carcasses and bones from slaughtered animals. Fishmongers dealt with fish skeletons and heads in vast quantities. A large fish market in a city like London or Paris might process thousands of pounds of fish daily, producing corresponding amounts of bony waste. These materials, if not disposed of, would rapidly putrefy, creating both sanitary and olfactory problems. The typical solution was disposal in rivers, burial in pits, or feeding to pigs and dogs. But an observant person might notice that bones, particularly after drying, would burn. And for people with no money for wood, coal, or other proper fuels, any combustible material became potentially valuable. The chemistry of bone combustion is more complex than might be expected. Bone is not a simple homogeneous material. It's a composite of organic and inorganic components, carefully arranged by biological processes to create a structure that's simultaneously strong, light, and flexible enough to withstand the forces of living movement. The primary inorganic component of bone is hydroxyapatite, a calcium phosphate mineral with the chemical formula CaPoGoA. This mineral comprises approximately 65 to 70% of bone's dry weight and provides its hardness and compressive strength. The remaining 30 to 35% is primarily collagen, a fibrous protein that provides flexibility and tensile strength, along with water, other proteins, and small amounts of lipids. When bone is heated, complex chemical and physical changes occur. First, the water content evaporates. Fresh bone might be 15 to 20% water by weight. As temperature increases, the organic components begin to decompose. Collagen, being a protein, undergoes thermal degradation starting around 390 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 grados, breaking down into simpler compounds and releasing energy in the process. The energy content of bone varies depending on the amount of marrow and residual soft tissue, but the organic components can provide approximately 2,000 to 4,000 BTUs per pound. Maintain high temperatures, acting as thermal mass that radiates heat even after the organic components have been consumed. Medieval bone burners developed techniques to maximize the fuel value of their material. Bones would be collected from butchers, fish markets, or other sources, sorted by type. Larger bones with more marrow were preferred, and dried thoroughly. Sometimes they would be cracked or crushed to expose marrow and internal surfaces, increasing the surface area available for combustion. Bones don't catch fire easily. The high mineral content and the structure of the organic components mean that bones typically smolder rather than flame. But bone combustion produces smoke of a particularly noxious character, and it's this smoke that created the health and social problems that would eventually lead to bans. Among the most problematic nitrogen compounds released during bone combustion is ammonia NH. A colorless gas with a sharp, pungent odor. Ammonia is highly irritating to the eyes, nose, and throat. At concentrations above 50 parts per million ppm, it causes immediate discomfort. Above 300 ppm, it's painful and dangerous. More dangerous than ammonia, however, is hydrogen sulfide H's. The infamous rotten egg gas. Like ammonia, hydrogen sulfide has a characteristic smell. At low concentrations, it smells like rotten eggs. At 500 ppm, it causes serious systemic effects, including metabolic acidosis and central nervous system damage. At 1000 ppm, it causes immediate collapse with respiratory paralysis. person breathing air with this concentration would collapse almost instantly and die within minutes. High-level exposure causes almost immediate loss of consciousness and death. Fire was seen as a form of purification in some contexts, but the burning of bones for mere warmth seemed to many clerics a misuse of both the remains and the element of fire. These theological concerns intensified dramatically when the practice extended to human bones. In times of plague or famine, when death tolls overwhelmed normal burial capacity, bodies might be placed in charnel houses or mass graves. Historical records explicitly document this practice in several cities during the Black Death of 1347 to 1351 and subsequent plague outbreaks. Others emphasized the offensive smell and its effect on property values and civic dignity arguments from merchants and property owners. Still others focused on theological concerns about proper treatment of God's creation arguments from ecclesiastical authorities. The severity of the penalties, particularly for burning human bones, reflects the profound cultural taboo being violated. Enforcement of bone-burning bans was complicated by the fact that the practice was most common among the desperately poor, who had little to lose from fines, and who might continue the practice clandestinely, despite the risks. In some cities, convicted bone burners were required to wear distinctive badges or clothing identifying their offense, turning them into pariahs. The scientific basis for banning bone burning was sound, even if medieval authorities couldn't articulate it in modern chemical terms. Modern analysis of bone combustion confirms that it produces hazardous levels of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and numerous other toxic compounds. Recent studies attempting to recreate historical bone-burning conditions for archaeological research have measured air quality during the process. The long-term health effects of chronic bone smoke exposure would include the obvious respiratory problems, chronic bronchitis, reduced lung capacity, scarring, but also less obvious systemic effects from ammonia and hydrogen sulfide exposure. Chronic low-level hydrogen sulfide exposure affects the nervous system, causing headaches, sleep disturbances, memory problems, and mood changes. Analysis of sediments from these sites shows elevated levels of phosphorus and calcium consistent with ash from bone combustion, and sometimes elevated levels of heavy metals that would have been present in bone tissue. Interestingly, the practice of bone burning wasn't entirely negative in its impacts. Modern organic farming sometimes uses bone meal, ground bones, as a phosphorus fertilizer. Following the same principle medieval farmers discovered empirically, the difference is that modern bone meal isn't burned, preserving more of the organic nitrogen content that's lost during combustion. The gradual decline of bone burning followed the same pattern as other banned heating practices, a combination of enforcement, increasing availability of alternative fuels, and social stigma made the practice less common over time. By the 16th century, bone burning had largely disappeared from major European cities, persisting only in the most remote or impoverished areas. The cultural memory of bone burning persisted much longer than the practice itself. The word bonfire, while it evolved to mean any large outdoor fire for celebration or disposal of waste, retained its etymological connection to the burning of bones. The bonfire controversy illustrates several important themes in the history of technology and regulation. Second, that practices can be simultaneously economically rational. Bones are waste material with fuel value, and culturally unacceptable burning remains, violates religious and social norms. Third, that health regulations often interact with religious and cultural values in complex ways. The bans on bone burning were justified on multiple grounds: health, culture, theology, and different stakeholders emphasized different justifications. The resulting prohibition was stronger because it commanded assent from multiple authorities, civil, medical, and religious, rather than just one. Finally, The bonfire controversy shows how language preserves historical practices long after the practices themselves have disappeared. Modern people lighting celebratory bonfires generally have no idea they're reusing a word that once literally meant a fire of bones, a practice their medieval ancestors would have found simultaneously necessary for the poor and abhorrent for the authorities who banned it. The medieval poor who burned bones weren't evil or depraved, they were cold, and they used what they had available. The authorities who banned the practice weren't arbitrary tyrants, they were responding to genuine health hazards, cultural concerns, and theological imperatives. The result was a practice that emerged from necessity, caused real harm, violated cultural norms, and was eventually prohibited, leaving behind only a word that most people no longer connect to its disturbing origins. Segment 10. The lime burner's disease expanded in the medieval construction industry. Few materials were as essential as lime. Not limestone, the raw calcium carbonate rock found in quarries across Europe, but quicklime calcium oxide, the product of heating limestone to extreme temperatures in specialized kilns. Quicklime was the foundation of mortar, the material that bound stone and brick into permanent structures. It was essential for plastering walls, making whitewash, tanning leather, and numerous other industrial processes. Without lime, the great cathedrals, castles, and town walls of medieval Europe could not have been built. But the production of quicklime required sustained temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, 980 grados, maintained for days at a time. The lime kilns that achieved these temperatures were essentially furnaces on a massive scale, consuming enormous quantities of fuel and operating at temperatures that made them dangerous to approach, let alone work around. The story of lime burning in medieval Europe is a story of industrial chemistry, practiced without understanding of chemistry, of occupational hazards endured because the product was indispensable. To understand why lime production was so dangerous, we must first understand the chemistry involved. Limestone is primarily calcium carbonate (CaCO), a compound that's stable at normal temperatures. CaCO plus heat gives Cal plus CO. The calcium carbonate breaks apart into calcium oxide quicklime and carbon dioxide gas. This is an endothermic reaction, meaning it requires continuous heat input to proceed. The carbon dioxide gas produced escapes from the kiln, and what remains is quicklime, a white or greyish substance that looks superficially similar to the limestone that went in, but which has dramatically different properties. The medieval lime kiln was typically a vertical shaft structure, built of heterosystent materials, firebrick, or thick stone walls capable of withstanding sustained high temperatures. The design varied by region and period, but the basic principle was consistent. Limestone was loaded into the top of the kiln, layered with fuel, typically wood or coal, later coke, and the fuel was ignited at the bottom. As the fuel burned, it heated the limestone above it to calcination temperature. The calcined lime would gradually descend through the kiln, eventually being drawn out at the bottom, while fresh limestone was continuously loaded at the top. Large lime kilns could be impressive structures, 20 to 30 feet tall, with internal chambers 10 to 15 feet in diameter. They operated continuously for days or weeks, consuming hundreds of tons of limestone and corresponding amounts of fuel. The heat they generated was intense. Workers described being unable to approach closer than 1015 feet from an operating kiln, and the radiant heat could be felt from 50 feet away on a cold day. This intense heat was essential for the calcination reaction, but it created obvious hazards. Workers tending the kiln risked severe burns from radiant heat and from accidental contact with hot surfaces. The kiln walls could reach temperatures of IV-500 degrees Fahrenheit, HA-260 degrees Celsius. On their outer surfaces, hot enough to cause severe burns instantly. Falls into or onto the kiln not uncommon given the lack of safety barriers, and the need to work at height to load limestone were invariably fatal. But the heat was only the beginning of the dangers. The carbon dioxide produced during calcination, enormous quantities of it, created an invisible hazard. Carbon dioxide is denser than air molecular weight, 44 versus air's average of 29, and tends to settle in low areas. Around an operating lime kiln, especially in calm weather conditions or in enclosed or partially enclosed structures, carbon dioxide could accumulate to dangerous levels. Carbon dioxide is untoxic in the same way that carbon monoxide is unbind to hemoglobin or poison cellular processes. But at high concentrations, it displaces oxygen, creating an atmosphere that can't support life. Workers approaching a lime kiln, particularly descending into pits or enclosed areas around the kiln base where carbon dioxide pooled, could suddenly find themselves in an oxygen-depleted atmosphere. The victim would feel dizzy and confused, perhaps have a few seconds to try to escape, then lose consciousness. If not immediately rescued, death from asphyxiation would follow within minutes. Medieval records document numerous deaths from what we would now recognize as carbon dioxide asphyxiation around lime kilns. The accounts describe workers who suddenly collapsed without warning, sometimes multiple workers at once if they were in the same oxygen-depleted area. Rescuers who rushed in to help often became victims themselves, overcome by the same invisible danger. These tragic incidents where rescuers died trying to save an initial victim are characteristic of confined space accidents involving carbon dioxide or other oxygen-displacing gases. But the most distinctive and feared hazard from lime burning was the quicklime itself. Quicklime, chemically calcium oxide (Ca), is an alkali strong base that reacts vigorously with water. The reaction is both exothermic, releases heat, and chemically violent. Ca plus HO gives CaOA plus heat. This reaction produces calcium hydroxide, slaked lime or hydrated lime, and releases approximately 27 kilojoules per mole of quicklime, enough heat that if water is added to a substantial quantity of quicklime, the water can be brought to boiling, generating steam. The danger of this reaction can't be overstated. Quicklime fresh from the kiln is intensely reactive. If water contacts it from rain, from moisture in the air, from spilled water, or worst of all, from human tissue, which is approximately 70% water, the reaction begins immediately. The heat generated can exceed 300 degrees Fahrenheit, 150 degrees Celsius in large quantities. Steam is produced explosively, potentially scattering hot quicklime and boiling calcium hydroxide over a wide area. When quicklime contacts skin, the combination of chemical burn calcium hydroxide is strongly alkaline, with a pH around 12.4, and thermal burn from the heat of the reaction causes devastating injuries. The calcium hydroxide penetrates into tissue, destroying cells and causing deep, slow-healing burns that are far more serious than thermal burns alone. Eyes are particularly vulnerable. Quicklime splashed into eyes can cause permanent blindness even with immediate treatment. Accounts speak of workers whose skin would melt away where quicklime contacted it, of limbs that had to be amputated due to quicklime burns, of men blinded for life by quicklime accidents. The treatments describe washing with vinegar, mildly acidic, which would neutralize the alkali, application of oil which provided a barrier against moisture, and in severe cases, amputation showed practical understanding of the injuries even without modern chemical knowledge. The most catastrophic incidents occurred when large quantities of quicklime accidentally contacted water. Medieval records document several explosions when rainwater accumulated in quicklime storage areas, or when quicklime was being transported by boat and the boat took on water. The resulting steam explosion, scattering burning quicklime and boiling calcium hydroxide solution, could kill or maim everyone in the vicinity. Workers noticed water accumulating in the hold, but didn't immediately understand the danger. The steam generation was so violent that it ruptured the boat's hull. The death toll was at least 12, with many more severely injured. Quicklime had to be kept in waterproof containers with covers. It couldn't be transported during rainy weather. Storage areas had to be covered and elevated to prevent water accumulation. These regulations, born from tragic experience, represent early industrial safety standards. The occupational health effects of chronic lime burning work were so distinctive that they were recognized as a specific disease entity. Lime burner S disease or Lyme disease. Workers who spent years tending lime kilns developed a characteristic constellation of symptoms: chronic cough from inhaling lime dust and kiln fumes, scarred hands and arms from repeated minor quicklime burns, and often eye problems from lime dust exposure. The respiratory effects resulted from inhaling calcium oxide dust, calcium hydroxide dust from quicklime that had partially reacted with moisture in the air, and the combustion products from the kill fires. The alkaline dust would cause chemical burns in the respiratory tract, leading to chronic inflammation, scarring, and reduced lung function. The attempts by some people to replicate limekiln heat for domestic purposes, mentioned in the original segment, represent a fundamental misunderstanding of the scale and danger involved. A limekiln is just a very hot fire at SN, industrial process, operating at temperatures and with chemical reactions that have no place in a domestic setting. Yet records do document attempts to use quicklime for heating, and the results were predictably disastrous. The basic concept was to use the exothermic reaction between quicklime and water to generate heat without combustion. This isn't entirely absurd in theory. The reaction does release substantial heat, and if controlled carefully, it could theoretically provide warmth without smoke or flame. The problem is control. The reaction between quicklime and water is violent and difficult to control with medieval technology. Adding too much water at once causes explosive steam generation. Adding water too slowly might not generate enough heat to be useful, and maintaining the reaction over time requires continuous addition of both quicklime and water in precise proportions far beyond what a household could manage safely. Accounts of domestic quicklime heating accidents describe explosions that destroyed rooms, severe burns to occupants, and in some cases deaths. In one incident documented in Norwich in 1388, a family attempting to heat their home with quicklime added water to a container of quicklime in their main room. The steam explosion scattered burning quicklime throughout the room. The thatched roof caught fire, the wooden structure burned, and 3 family members died too from burns and steam scalding. Good night, travelers. May your own journeys through history continue to surprise and delight you, revealing the strange, the wonderful, and the deeply human in places you never expected to find them. Until we meet again in another corner of the past, another forgotten story waiting to be told. Sleep well and dream of mongooses guarding emperors, ravens speaking truth to kings, and all the other remarkable creatures who remind us that history is far stranger, far richer, and far more fascinating than we ever imagined. The past is never truly dead. It lives on in the stories we tell, the connections we remember, and the animals who, whether they knew it or not, helped shape the course of human events simply by being themselves. Safe travels, dear friends, and good night.